This is a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online, the online resource for all construction professionals that's available 24/7, with over 9 hours of video presentations and all for only £7 a month. Please don't forget to subscribe at the place you usually get your podcast so as not to miss a thing, as well as visiting our YouTube channel. Hello again and welcome to another podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. As usual, Barney, my red Labrador, is here to offer his advice and to keep an eye on content. And by the way, Barney and I would really appreciate it if you would write a review. If you're new to Duncan Cartlidge Online podcasts, welcome. Please don't forget to subscribe, as well as catching up with the previous episodes. If you are already a subscriber, a really big thank you for your support. Please spread the word. In this absolutely jam-packed episode, we'll be looking at single-stage selective tendering practice, AI, what exactly are industry's expectations, and the RICS, total disconnect. So we'll kick off with selective single-stage tendering practice. Even though selective single-stage tendering is frowned on by some these days as not delivering value for money and for its lack of early contractor involvement, it has been described as a race to the bottom, although it is still popular. Around 25% of construction procurements with clients for whom initial capital costs is important choose single-stage tendering. But how do you find a contractor that matches the client's value requirements? There are various guides available, for example, the 2024 JCT Practice Note on Tendering. Now, at £33 for some 20-odd pages, it does seem a bit on the expensive side, although it does have several standard forms and letters that can be used during the tendering process, including a form of tender. In fact, this document is an update of a free guidance note, the NJCC, that's the defunct National Joint Consultative Committee for Building Code of Practice for Single-Stage Competitive Tendering, that was published in 1996. Incidentally, I did find a copy of the NJCC document on Google, and if you can get your hands on one, it's still a useful source of reference. The RICS Black Book also has a chapter on tendering, albeit, like much of the Black Book, and the RICS for that matter, is out of date. When managing tendering, irrespective of the chosen path, you should be alert to the possibility of corrupt practices, for example cover pricing and bid rigging. And it's not just the little-known SMEs trying to fiddle the figures. National household names have been named and shamed a number of times in the past for colluding during the tender process for public sector projects, with, in some cases, colluding contractors receiving compensation payments from fellow conspirators for agreeing to allow competitors to be awarded the contract. You can almost hear the self-justification for unethical corrupt practice. Nobody got hurt, the client is happy, and the job gets done. Market conditions will impact on pricing. Shortage of work can result in suicidal bids being submitted in the hope that variations and additions, once the contract has been awarded, will compensate. I was in the chief estimator's office of a major contractor a few years ago. This is when work was scarce. He had received tenders from 3 subcontractors for large areas of suspended ceiling. One bid stood out as being very low, and on examination, it turned out that there wasn't an allowance for labour costs. Of course, these bids should be rejected. However, that's not always the case. When tenders were received for the replacement Forth road crossing in Scotland in 2011, it was reported that there was a £250,000 difference between the lowest and the second lowest bid, and the alarm bell started ringing. However, on examination, the lowest bid was found to be bona fide and was accepted. The accepted bid of £790 million was against an initial estimate of between £900 million and £1.2 billion. So, how should you proceed to ensure that the client gets bang for buck? The first stage is to draw up a tender list. That's to say, Tier 1 contractors that everybody, including the client, is happy with a proven track record for delivery. Not always easy, of course, as everybody wants the best. You could use KPIs to help your choice, but I don't know anybody who does. One way to reduce the time taken to draw up a tender list is to pre-qualify contractors and place them on a framework. Best suited to large procurement programs of repetitive work, frameworks have become less popular recently as they can be expensive for contractors to join, and of course, there's no guarantee of work. Before preliminary inquiry letters are sent out, I always find it a good idea to make informal contact, giving brief details of the proposed project to see whether or not contractors are available and interested. Assuming that it's possible to find 3 or 4 contractors, then inquiry letters can be sent out expanding the project details, including the clients, the name of the consultant, the tender period, there's a recommended minimum of 28 days, the estimated cost, start and completion dates, and particulars of the form of contract, including any special conditions and particulars of any named subcontractors. A full list is included in the guides mentioned previously. There are many who say that gone are the days when cheapest is best. Emphasis should be on value for money over the life cycle of the building. But for many clients, bottom line capital cost is still important, although other criteria may be used to select a contractor. The selection criteria must be disclosed to the tenderers, with selection being based on the highest weighted score. It is usual to weight price and non-price qualitative factors in the assessment to reflect the relative importance of price overall and the complexity of the work and the context in which it is to be carried out. Criteria could be a mixture of price, value for money, sustainability, innovation, cultural fit, etc., etc. And now we move on to errors. Errors can occur either in the tender documentation or the submitted tenders. In the case of the former, if a contractor points out during the tender period that there are errors or omissions in, say, the bill of quantities, then it should be corrected. The other tendering contractors must be informed so that corrections can be made and everyone works on the same basis. It is important that confirmation of the receipt of errors is received and understood from all the tendering contractors, even if this means sending several reminders. Tenders can make legitimate errors when pricing contract documents, and there are 2 accepted alternatives to deal with the situation. It must be made clear in the tender instructions which of the alternatives is going to apply. When using Alternative 1, corrections are not permitted. The preferred tenderer is given details of the errors and is given the opportunity to confirm or withdraw their offer. If confirmed, prices, excluding the preliminaries, contingencies and provisional sums, will be adjusted. If the tenderer is not prepared to confirm the offer, it is withdrawn and the second lowest is examined. This approach is thought to be inconsistent with partnering and is not considered appropriate for 2-stage tendering. When using Alternative 2, corrections are permitted. In this case, the preferred tenderer is given the opportunity to confirm their offer or amending it to correct genuine errors. If the errors are amended, and this has the effect of increasing their bid to a point where it is no longer the cheapest or best value, it should be discarded and the second lowest bid examined. Of course, the tenderer may elect to stand by their bid, in which case a signed endorsement is added. It is thought that this approach is subject to abuse if not supervised properly. Other errors, in inverted commas, may become apparent when the tenders are received. These fall into the category of deliberate errors by the tenderers to muddy the waters. For example, a common practice is for tenderers to insert a caveat stating that parts of the work have not been priced for some reason or other, thereby giving the impression of a low bid. Contractors should be asked to price the work or withdraw their tender. We now come on to tender rules. The tender rules should be set out in the formal invitation letter that accompanies the dispatch of tender documentation and should be worded to keep the possibility of bid rigging to a minimum. Tender rules, amongst other things, should cover the following items: guidance on how the documents are to be completed, pricing and other insertions, instructions on the return of the tender, how tender documents are to be returned, where, when, format, etc. Usually this is high noon on a specific date at a specific place that could be the architect's or the client's offices. Any key dates in the tender assessment should be given. A list of tender documentation in either hard copy or digital format. Bid evaluation techniques, if not on price alone as discussed earlier. In England and Wales it is usual only to have the form of tender returned, whereas in Scotland practice is more diverse and in some cases the price bills are returned. There are pros and cons to both approaches. The period for which the tender remains open for acceptance should be given, remembering that in England and Wales an offer may be withdrawn at any time before acceptance. Once received, it is usually the quantity surveyor who is required to carry out due diligence, as contractors and subcontractors can be cunning little so-and-sos when it comes to pricing. One of the many advantages of the much maligned bill of quantities is that all tenders are submitted on the same basis, and for this, quantity surveyors will be eternally grateful. As someone who has worked in France, where tenderers are encouraged to use the concept design as the basis for their tender and include with their bid various method statements and in some cases design solutions, results in a very complex process when comparing bids. During the due diligence process, items that should attract special scrutiny are checking the general level of pricing and consistency across various trades, for example, ensuring that the rates for the groundworks that appear in several sections are priced consistently. Check for front loading of the bills, that's to say checking that early work, groundworks for example, have not been priced at enhanced rates to improve cash flow, with compensating reduced rates in the later trades. Provisional quantities should be avoided, but if they are included, the pricing should be checked. Enhanced rates can be included in the hope that when it is remeasured, the enhanced rates will apply to increased quantities. The final act is the tender report, and this should include the tenders received with the results, a comparison with the estimate cost plan and any necessary reconciliation, a discussion of any qualifications and amendments, and a detailed analysis of the tender, and finally, of course, a recommendation of which one to accept. Assuming the recommendation is accepted, the parties enter into a formal contract and work begins. And now moving on to the topic of the moment. Yes, it's digital construction. At a recent seminar on AI in construction, 140 plus attendees were asked to write their thoughts on what they thought the impact of AI will be by 2035. Some of the comments were from household names, and even they were struggling to define the AI future, apart from comments like, we can expect enhanced automation and elimination of substantial amount of work, whatever that means. Other comments included greater connectivity, a move away from silo working, and an improvement in standardisation. Universities were taken to task for not closing the skills gap. However, there were also a substantial number of attendees who were cynical about the ability for construction to change within the next 10 years. One thing is for sure, it'll be a long time before we see robots driving dumpers and pumping concrete. There are reports from America that the AI bubble is already showing signs of bursting. And, you know what they say, what happens in America today happens here tomorrow. And finally, the RICS, the story that just keeps on giving. This week, I received a demand for £730 from the RICS for my annual fees. This compares with £470 for the ICE and around £500 for the RIBA. Along with the demand, I received an assurance from the RICS that it continues to deliver value for money through, and I quote, enhanced local resources, valuable standards, and a new one for me, thought leadership. Quite honestly, I'm coming to the conclusion that the RICS couldn't run a bath, let alone a professional institution. Voting to elect members to the Governing Council of the RICS took place recently. Of the members eligible to vote, only 6.5% bothered. That's even lower than last year. It appears to many that the RICS does little for members apart from asking for money and demanding higher and higher fees, so it's no wonder that apathy has set in. Just like MPs, the RICS appears to be locked in a Westminster bubble, as everybody in the RICS seems to think that everything is going swimmingly, as demonstrated by the last AGM. However, if you are a QS, then the acting president of the RICS, note acting, Mothman is still hiding in the wings. See what he did there? He did have some good news for you this week. He said that there was an enormous demand for quantity surveyors with immense opportunities for both a new generation of surveyors and for existing professionals to upskill across the exciting landscape of technological change. More about this in the next podcast. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope that you found it interesting. Thank you for listening. Barney and I think you ooze stamina. This has been a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. Barney and I would really appreciate it if you were to spread the word, subscribe, and, if you have time, write a review. Until next time, take care.